Kansas Prairie, 1872. Sometimes the hardest choices aren't between good and evil, but between survival and ruin. Ruth Ellen Whitley learned this truth on a bitter winter night, when compassion nearly cost her everything she had left. At 17, already carrying a child with no husband, she lived at the mercy of a town where mercy was scarce. Her preacher father had died, leaving her with nothing but his reputation and a bitter aunt's reluctant charity. Then came the storm, and with it a choice that would seal her fate. When Dana collapsed at her door, half frozen and desperate, Ruth faced the kind of decision that defines a life. Give shelter to a stranger and risk everything, or turn him away and live with the weight of what might have been. She chose kindness. By morning, that choice had transformed from blessing to curse, forcing her into a marriage neither wanted but both desperately needed. But what happens when survival becomes something more? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The knocking came a third time, weaker now, followed by what sounded like something heavy collapsing against the door. Ruth rose carefully, her back protesting the movement. At 6 months pregnant, every action required deliberate thought, every step a calculated negotiation between her body's limitations and her will. She approached the door slowly, pressing her ear to the rough wood, and heard something that made her breath catch. A low moan, barely human, desperate with cold and exhaustion. "Please," came a voice, muffled by the storm but unmistakably male. "Please, I'm dying out here." Ruth's hand hovered over the wooden bar that secured the door. Her father had taught her never to open their home to strangers after dark, especially not when she was alone. The prairie attracted all manner of men, some decent, others dangerous, and many who fell somewhere between those extremes, depending on their circumstances and desperation. But the voice came again, weaker now, and she heard something in it that cut through her caution like warm steel through butter. Not the calculating tone of a man planning harm, but the raw honesty of someone facing death and finding it wanting. She lifted the bar. The door swung inward on a gust of wind that nearly knocked her backward, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the sharp scent of horses and leather. A man collapsed across her threshold, his body hitting the wooden floor with the weight of something vital giving way. Snow covered him so completely that for a moment Ruth couldn't tell where his clothes ended and the storm began. He was longer than her father had been, and broader through the shoulders, though that breadth might have been the thick coat that wrapped around him like dark bark. His hat had fallen off somewhere in his approach to her door, leaving hair the color of wet sand matted to his skull. His face, what she could see of it, bore the weathered look of a man who'd spent years under an unforgiving sun. Ruth struggled to close the door against the wind, her pregnant body lacking the leverage to make quick work of it. By the time she'd secured the latch and turned back to her unexpected visitor, she could see the extent of his condition. His lips had gone blue-white with cold, and his breathing came in shallow, rapid pants that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows and the stubble along his jaw. His hands, when she could see them, appeared mottled with frostbite, the fingers drawn up like claws against the cold. Wherever he'd come from, he'd been traveling in this storm for hours. "Mister?" Ruth knelt beside him as carefully as her condition. Aloud, one hand on his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, grey as storm clouds, she noticed, and fixed on her face with an expression of confusion and desperate gratitude. Thought I was dreaming," he whispered. "Angel of mercy in a warm cabin." "No angel," Ruth replied, though something about his words warmed her more than the fire had. "Just a woman with some sense. Can you sit up?" With her help, he managed to struggle into a sitting position, though the effort left him gasping. Snow melted from his coat in spreading puddles across her clean floor, but Ruth found she didn't care. The smell of him, Horse and leather and the cold outdoors filled her cabin with a foreign masculinity that was both alarming and oddly comforting. "Name's Cal," he managed, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Cal Danner. I was trying to reach town before you froze to death," Ruth finished. "You came close to managing it. Let's get this coat off you." The coat, when she helped him remove it, revealed a man built for hard work. Broad shoulders, strong arms, the kind of frame that spoke of years handling cattle and horses and the 1,000 tasks that frontier life demanded. His clothes beneath were soaked through but of better quality than she'd expected, suggesting he wasn't quite the drifter he might have appeared. More interesting was what fell from his coat pocket as they worked to remove it. A bridle made of expensive leather, tooled with the kind of craftsmanship that cost serious money. The silver fittings caught the firelight like small stars, and Ruth noticed how Cal's eyes followed the bridle's fall to the floor with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's not mine," he said quietly, perhaps noticing her attention. "Not exactly." Ruth studied his face, noting the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes when he spoke about the bridle. Whatever story lay behind that piece of tack, it wasn't one he felt comfortable telling to a stranger who'd just saved his life. "Right. Now, I don't care if you stole it from the governor's horse," Ruth said, surprising herself with her bluntness. "What matters is getting you warm before you die in my cabin." She helped him closer to the fire, where he sat shivering violently as feeling returned to his extremities. Ruth heated water on her small stove and brought him a cup of weak coffee, the last of her precious reserves, but the man clearly needed warming from the inside out. "Drink it slow," she instructed, settling back into her chair with a grunt of relief. The baby had begun moving again, perhaps disturbed by the excitement, and she rested both hands on her belly while watching Cal carefully. He drank the coffee with the reverence of a man receiving communion, his grey eyes closing as the warm liquid worked its way through his system. When he opened them again, they fixed on Ruth with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, her unbound hair, the way her father's old nightgown couldn't quite conceal her condition. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to know I'm grateful for the kindness, but I don't want to bring you trouble. If folks in town knew you'd taken in a stranger—" "The town's opinion of me can hardly get worse," Ruth replied, more bitterly than she'd intended. "I'm already their cautionary tale." Cal's gaze moved to her swelling belly, then back to her face, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression. No judgment, she noted with surprise, just a quiet comprehension of how the world worked and what it did to women who found themselves outside its narrow definitions of acceptability. "Still," he said quietly, "a woman in your condition shouldn't be taking risks." "A woman in my condition has little left to lose," Ruth countered. "Besides, what was I supposed to do? Let you freeze on my doorstep? I may have fallen from grace, but I haven't lost my humanity." Something shifted in Cal's expression at her words, a softening around the eyes that suggested her response had touched something deeper than mere gratitude. He studied her face as if trying to memorize it, as if she were the first person in a very long time to surprise him with simple decency. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ruth Ellen Whitley." "Whitley," he repeated the name slowly, recognition dawning. "The preacher's daughter." Ruth's back stiffened. "You knew my father." "Heard of him. Heard he was a good man who helped folks without asking too many questions about their past." Cal's voice carried a note of respect that few people had managed. "When speaking of her father lately, seems kindness runs in the family." The compliment hit Ruth unexpectedly, warming her from the inside out in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. When had someone last spoken to her with simple respect, without pity or judgment clouding their words? He was a good man. She agreed quietly. "Better than this town deserved, maybe." Cal nodded, understanding implicit in the gesture. "Towns like this, they're hard on people who don't fit their idea of proper." "And what about you?" Ruth asked. "Do you fit their idea of proper?" Cal's laugh held no humor. "Ma'am, I'm about as far from proper as a man can get and still be walking upright." The admission should have alarmed her, but Ruth found herself more curious than frightened. There was something in Cal's manner, a fundamental decency beneath whatever rough edges life had carved into him, that spoke to the same instinct that had made her open the door in the first place. "Well," she said, surprising herself again. "Proper. Never kept anyone warm on a night like this." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled between them. Cal's color was returning, and his shivering had subsided to occasional tremors. Ruth found herself stealing glances at him, noting the careful way he held himself, the alertness in his posture despite his exhaustion. This was a man accustomed to being ready for trouble. "You can't travel tonight," Ruth said eventually. "The storm's getting worse, and you're in no condition to be out in it." "I can't stay," Cal replied, though his tone suggested he wanted to. It wouldn't be right. A woman alone, especially a woman carrying a child out of wedlock. Ruth finished. "Mr. Danner, my reputation is already beyond repair. What's one more scandal?" But even as she spoke the words, Ruth knew they weren't entirely true. There was always further to fall, always another rung down the ladder of respectability. A single woman, pregnant and alone with a strange man overnight. That would provide Millfield with enough gossip to last until spring. Still, she couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. The presence of another human being in her cabin, someone who spoke, to her without judgment or pity, felt like a gift she hadn't known she needed. "I'll sleep by the fire," Cal said quietly. "Won't be the first time I've made do with less." Ruth retrieved her father's spare quilt from the chest at the foot of her bed, along with an extra pillow that still smelled faintly of the lavender. Water her mother had used. Cal accepted them with the gravity of a man receiving something precious, and Ruth realized that simple human kindness might be as rare in his life as it had become in hers. "There's bread in the kitchen," she said, "and some preserves. Help yourself if you get hungry." "Ma'am, Ruth." Cal's voice stopped her as she started toward her bedroom. "I want you to know, I'll remember this, the kindness you've shown tonight. It means more than you know." Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. It had been so long since anyone had spoken her name with warmth instead of disappointment. She settled into her narrow bed, listening to Cal moving quietly around the cabin as he banked the fire and arranged his makeshift bedding. The sounds of another person in her space should have felt intrusive, but instead they provided a comfort she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The baby stirred within her, and she placed a hand on her belly, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude for the storm that had brought this stranger to her door. Whatever consequences tomorrow might bring, tonight she wasn't alone. Outside, the wind began to subside, and Ruth drifted toward sleep with the knowledge that morning would bring choices she wasn't prepared to make. But for now, in the warm darkness of her cabin, with the sound of another person's breathing providing counterpoint to the storm's fading fury, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt safe. Dawn would prove how dangerous that feeling could be. Ruth woke to the sound of someone chopping wood and the smell of coffee stronger than any she'd managed to brew in weeks. Pale morning light filtered through her frost-covered windows, and for a moment she lay still, remembering the events of the previous night with the disorientation of someone emerging from a vivid dream. Then she heard Cal's voice outside, low and measured, speaking to what sounded like a horse, and reality settled over her like cold water. She dressed quickly, her movements hampered by the baby's weight, and her own reluctance to face whatever the morning might bring. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found the cabin transformed. The fire burned bright and warm, coffee bubbled on the stove, and through the window she could see Cal splitting logs with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. The stolen bridle sat on her kitchen table beside a piece of paper covered in careful handwriting. Ruth picked up the note, recognizing the measured script of someone who'd learned his letters late in life, but took pride in getting them right. Miss Ruth, it read, I've chopped enough wood to last you through the rest of winter and seen to your horse. The coffee's fresh and there's bacon if you want it. I figured to head out soon as the roads are passable, but I wanted to leave you with something more than just my thanks. The bridal's worth enough to see you through till spring, maybe longer. It's yours now, free and clear of whatever complications it might have brought with it. A woman with your kindness shouldn't have to worry about keeping warm or fed. Cal Danner. Ruth read the note twice, her throat tightening with each word. She moved to the window and watched Cal work, noting the smooth rhythm of his movements. The way he'd stacked the split wood with military precision against the side of her cabin. Steam rose from his shoulders in the cold air, and she could see that he'd already harnessed her horse and hitched it to the small sledge her father had built for winter hauling. The man was preparing to disappear from her life as quietly as he'd entered it. She was still standing at the window when the sound of approaching voices cut through the morning air like a blade. Cal heard them too, his axe freezing mid-swing as he turned toward the road. 3 figures were making their way through the snow toward her cabin, their dark shapes stark against the white landscape. Ruth's heart sank as she recognized them. Ezra Blackwood, her nearest neighbor and the town's most dedicated gossip. Constance, her aunt, moving with the grim purpose of someone about to deliver judgment, and behind them, Judge Harwell himself, his presence lending official weight to whatever was about to unfold. Cal set down the axe and moved toward the cabin. With the measured pace of a man who'd faced similar confrontations before, Ruth met him at the door, and she saw in his grey eyes the same resignation she felt settling in her own chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This is my fault." "No," Ruth replied, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "This is what happens when decent people try to help each other in a place that's forgotten what decency looks like." The delegation reached her door with the solemnity of a funeral procession. Ezra Blackwood knocked with the authority of someone carrying out an unpleasant but necessary duty, while Constance stood behind him, with her lips pressed into their familiar line of disapproval. Judge Harwell's presence transformed what might have been neighborhood gossip into something with the weight of law behind it. Ruth opened the door and faced them with what dignity she could muster. "Gentlemen, Aunt Constance." "Ruth Ellen Whitley," Judge Harwell began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used in his courtroom. "It has come to our attention that you spent the night in the company of this man, alone and without proper supervision." "I gave shelter to someone who would have died in the storm," Ruth replied. "The same as any Christian would do. The same as any Christian woman with proper regard for her reputation would not do," Constance interjected, her voice sharp with righteous anger. "A decent woman would have directed him to the barn or sent him on to town to freeze to death." Ruth felt her own anger rising. "Would that have better served your sense of Christian charity?" "What would have better served," Judge Harwell said heavily, "would have been consideration for the consequences of your actions. Miss Whitley, you are already the subject of considerable discussion in our community. This development can only make your situation more difficult." Cal stepped forward, his hat in his hands, but his posture straight and uncompromising. "Your Honor, if I may, Miss Whitley showed me nothing but proper Christian kindness. I slept by the fire, she remained in her room, and nothing improper occurred. Between us," Ezra Blackwood's laugh held no humor, "son, what occurred or didn't occur isn't the point. What matters is appearance, and the appearance is that a single woman, already carrying a child out of wedlock, spent the night alone with a strange man. In a town that values moral standards, that appearance is enough." "Enough for what?" Ruth demanded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Judge Harwell cleared his throat, the sound carrying years of experience delivering unwelcome verdicts. "Miss Whitley, the Ladies' Aid Society has been generous in their tolerance of your situation. However, this latest incident has exhausted their patience. They feel that your continued presence in our community sends the wrong message to our young people about the consequences of moral failure. You're casting me out, Ruth said quietly. We're offering you an alternative, Constance said, her voice softening slightly. There are arrangements that can be made. Families in other towns who would be willing to take in a woman in your condition. See you through your confinement, perhaps help place the child with a proper family. Ruth's hands moved instinctively to her belly, protective and defiant. And if I refuse, then you'll need to find somewhere else to make your home, Judge Harwell said. I'm sorry, Miss Whitley, but the community has reached its decision. The words hung in the cold air like a death sentence. Ruth felt the world narrowing around her, all her options crumbling like sand through her fingers. Cast out in winter, 6 months pregnant, with nowhere to go and no resources beyond what Cal's bridal might bring. However, Judge Harwell continued, and something in his tone made Ruth look up sharply, there is one other possibility. Cal stepped closer to Ruth, perhaps sensing the direction the conversation was about to take. Marriage, the judge said simply. If you were to marry Mr. Danner here, it would regularize your situation somewhat. A married woman, even one whose first child arrives suspiciously early, faces less censure than an unwed mother. Marriage to a complete stranger? Ruth's voice came out higher than she'd intended. A stranger who has already compromised your reputation, Constance added. Under the circumstances, it seems the most practical solution. Ruth turned to look at Cal, seeing her own shock reflected in his expression. They'd known each other for less than 12 hours, had shared perhaps an hour's worth of actual conversation, and now these people were suggesting they bind their lives together to satisfy the community's sense of moral order. And if we refuse this generous offer, Cal asked, his voice carefully controlled, then you'll both need to find somewhere else to live, Judge Harwell replied. Mr. Danner, I assume you have your own reasons for avoiding official scrutiny. Marriage to Miss Whitley would provide you with certain protections as well. Ruth caught the implication in the judge's words and saw Cal's jaw tighten. Whatever past Cal was running from, Judge Harwell suspected enough to use it as leverage. I need time to think, Ruth said. I'm afraid time is a luxury you don't have, Ezra Blackwood interjected. The community's decision is final. Marriage or exile, Miss Whitley. Those are your choices. Ruth looked at Cal again, searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. She found compassion there, and something that might have been resignation, but also a strength that suggested he'd faced harder choices than this and survived them. Miss Ruth, Cal said quietly, I know this isn't what either of us planned, but if it means you can stay in your home, near people who've known you all your life, I'm willing if you are. The offer was made without romance or pretty speeches, just the practical kindness of a man who understood that sometimes survival mattered more than sentiment. Ruth found herself oddly grateful for his honesty. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you opened your door to a stranger in a storm, Cal replied. I know you shared your food and warmth with someone who had no claim on your charity. That tells me what I need to know about your character. And you? Ruth asked. What should I know about yours? Cal's smile was rueful. I'm not a perfect man, Miss Ruth. I've made mistakes, done things I'm not proud of, but I'm not cruel. I don't drink to excess, and I've never raised a hand to a woman or child. If you'll have me, I'll do my best to be a decent husband. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest, and honesty felt like a rare commodity in Ruth's world lately. Very well, she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. I accept your proposal, Mr. Danner. Judge Harwell nodded with evident relief. Excellent. I can perform the ceremony this afternoon, if that's acceptable to both parties. And so, it was settled, with all the romance of a business transaction and about as much choice. Ruth Ellen Whitley would become Ruth Danner before the sun set, married to a man she'd known for 12 hours to satisfy a community's sense of moral propriety. The hastily written marriage certificate would sit in Judge Harwell's office by evening, binding two strangers together in the eyes of God and Kansas law. But as Ruth watched the delegation depart, she found herself wondering if this piece of paper might prove to be either her salvation or her doom. Cal began splitting wood again, the rhythm of his axe providing steady counterpoint to Ruth's racing. Her thoughts. In a few hours, she would be a married woman. The question was whether that change would bring her the security she desperately needed, or simply trade one set of problems for another. Only time would tell. The wedding ceremony took place in Judge Harwell's front parlor at 4 o'clock, witnessed by 6 people who attended out of duty rather than celebration. Ruth wore her mother's best dress, altered hastily to accommodate her growing belly, while Cal had borrowed a clean shirt from Henrik at the Mercantile. The whole affair lasted less than 10 minutes, including the time it took to sign the certificate that would bind their lives together. Ruth's hands shook as she wrote her new name for the first time, Ruth Ellen Danner. The ink seemed to take forever to dry, as if the letters themselves were reluctant to make their union official. By the power vested in me by the state of Kansas, Judge Harwell intoned, I now pronounce you husband and wife. There was no kiss to seal their union, just a brief handshake between the new spouses and a round of stiff congratulations from the witnesses. Constance dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from relief or sorrow, Ruth couldn't tell. Dr. Walsh offered to examine Ruth at her convenience, now that she had proper medical coverage through her husband. Even this small kindness came wrapped in judgment. Within an hour, Ruth found herself back in her cabin, their cabin now, watching. Cal arranged his few belongings with the careful precision of a man accustomed to living light. His possessions fit easily into a single canvas bag. 2 changes of clothes, a razor and soap, a small leather-bound book that he handled with particular care, and a wooden cross that looked like he'd carved it himself. Ruth picked up the cross, admiring the simple craftsmanship. The wood was smooth with handling, and tiny details had been carved along the arms. Flowers, she realized, though worn nearly smooth by years of touch. My mother's favorite, Cal said quietly, noticing her attention. Wild roses. She always said they proved God could make something beautiful grow anywhere, even in the harshest ground. It's lovely work, Ruth said, handing it back to him. You made this? Started it the day she died. Took me near a year to get it right. Cal placed the cross carefully on the small shelf beside Ruth's father's Bible. Figured she'd like knowing it was next to the good book. The simple gesture touched Ruth more than any of the day's formal proceedings. Here was a man who honored his mother's memory with patient craftsmanship, who found beauty in wildflowers and meaning in suffering. Perhaps their hasty marriage wouldn't prove to be the disaster she'd feared. Tell me about her, Ruth said, settling into her chair by the fire. The baby had been active all day, perhaps responding to her tension, and she welcomed the chance to rest. Cal stoked the fire before joining her, taking the chair her father had used for his evening reading. For a moment, the domesticity of the scene struck Ruth as surreal. A married couple sharing their first evening together, talking about family as if they'd known each other for years rather than hours. Sarah Danner was the strongest woman I ever knew, Cal began, his voice carrying the warm cadence of cherished memory. Lost 3 babies before me, then my father to consumption when I was 12. Worked herself near to death keeping our little farm running, but she never complained, never lost her faith, even when it seemed like God had forgotten we existed. How old were you when she passed? 19. Old enough to think I was a man, too young to understand what being a man actually meant. Cal's smile held no humor. Made some poor choices after that. Thought I knew better than her teachings about forgiveness and turning the other cheek. Ruth heard the weight of regret in his words and recognized the sound. She'd been carrying similar burdens since Thomas Henley had vanished from her life, leaving her to face the consequences of their shared mistakes alone. We all make poor choices when we're young, she said gently. The measure of a person isn't in never falling down, it's in how they pick themselves up afterward. Your father teach you that wisdom? My father taught me many things. That was one of the few I learned well enough to practice. Ruth shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position as the baby pressed against her ribs. "Though I sometimes wonder if picking yourself up is enough, or if some mistakes leave permanent marks." Cal's gaze moved to her belly, then back to her face. "You talking about the child?" "I'm talking about the choices that led to the child." Ruth found herself speaking more honestly than she'd intended. "I loved Thomas Henley, or thought I did. Believed his promises about marriage and respectability. When he left, I felt like a fool for trusting him, but I couldn't bring myself to regret loving him. Love's not something to regret, even when it's not returned the way it should be. The town seems to think otherwise. The town's never been 19 and in love with someone who talked pretty and promised the world." Cal's voice carried an understanding that suggested personal experience. "Easy enough to judge from a distance, harder to remember what it feels like to believe in someone completely." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire paint dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Ruth found herself studying Cal's profile in the flickering light, noting the way he held himself with careful alertness even while relaxed. This was a man who'd learned to watch for trouble, to be ready for whatever might come through the door. "Where will you look for work?" she asked eventually. "Figured I'd start with the outlying farms. Most folks need extra hands for winter chores, and I know my way around horses and cattle." Cal paused, then added, "Though I suspect your new husband's reputation will need some building before anyone trusts me with anything valuable. It won't be easy. This isn't a community that warms quickly to outsiders. I've worked in unfriendly places before. Long as a man does honest work for honest pay, most folks eventually come around." Cal turned to look at her directly. "What I'm wondering is how you want to handle things between us. I meant what I said about being a decent husband, but I know this isn't what either of us planned." Ruth appreciated his directness, even as it forced her to confront questions she'd been avoiding. What did marriage mean when it was built on necessity rather than affection? How did two strangers navigate the intimate territory of shared living, when their union was more business arrangement than romantic partnership? "I suppose we'll have to figure that out as we go," she said finally. "I've never been married before, and I suspect your previous experience with domestic arrangements was different from this." Cal's laugh was rueful. "I've been on my own since I was 19. Lived rough, mostly. Never stayed anywhere long enough to worry about things like whose turn it was to cook or how to divide up chores." "Well, then we'll both be learning." Ruth struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to her lower back. "For tonight you can keep sleeping by the fire. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make this work long term." "Ruth," Cal said as she started toward her bedroom, "I want you to know I'll try to make this as easy on you as I can. You're carrying enough burdens without me adding to them, and I'll try to be a proper wife, whatever that means under our circumstances." Ruth paused in the doorway. "Thank you, Cal, for everything. I know this isn't what you bargained for when you knocked on my door last night." "Maybe not," Cal replied, "but sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never see coming." Ruth carried his words with her into sleep, though she wasn't sure if he'd meant them as comfort or simply politeness. The baby settled as she lay down, perhaps soothed by her finally relaxing, and she found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take in the space of 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been Ruth Whitley, disgraced preacher's daughter facing exile from the only home she'd ever known. Tonight, she was Ruth Danner, married woman with a husband who carved crosses and spoke of his mother with tender reverence. The change felt both enormous and strangely natural, as if some part of her had been waiting for this shift without realizing it. Cal's presence in her cabin brought a sense of security she hadn't felt since her father's death, a feeling that she wasn't entirely alone against whatever challenges lay ahead. From the main room came the quiet sounds of Cal banking the fire and settling into his makeshift bed. Ruth listened to him moving around her cabin with the careful consideration of a guest who understood he was sharing someone else's space and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Perhaps their arrangement would prove to be more blessing than burden. Perhaps two broken people could build something whole together, even if they'd started with duty rather than love. Outside, the Kansas wind sang through the prairie grass, carrying with it the promise of challenges ahead. Drought, judgment, and whatever secrets Cal's past might hold. But inside their small cabin, two people who'd found each other through necessity were beginning to discover the possibility of something deeper. Time would test whether that possibility could grow into something lasting, but for tonight, it was enough that neither of them faced the darkness alone. 2 weeks into their marriage, Ruth sat cross-legged on her bed with fabric scraps spread around her like fallen autumn leaves. Her sewing basket, a wedding gift from her mother years before her death, held treasures accumulated over a lifetime of careful thrift. Bits of cotton from worn-out dresses, flannel from her father's old shirts, lace salvaged from undergarments. Too delicate for frontier life, but too precious to discard entirely. Now those remnants would become her baby's first wardrobe. Ruth held up a tiny sleeve she'd just finished, no longer than her hand from wrist to fingertip, and marveled at how something so small could represent such enormous hope. The fabric came from one of her mother's church dresses, a soft blue cotton that had faded to the color of winter sky, but still held its shape after all these years. Making progress, Cal observed from the doorway where he'd been watching her. Work with quiet attention. Slowly, Ruth smoothed the fabric over her growing belly. It's hard to imagine someone small enough to wear these things actually fitting inside me. Cal entered the room and settled into the chair beside her bed, a liberty that had developed naturally over the past weeks as they'd grown more comfortable with each other's presence. He picked up one of the completed gowns, examining Ruth's, careful stitching with the attention of someone who understood quality workmanship. "My mother used to say that babies came with everything they needed except clothes and love," he said. "Looks like this little one will have both in abundance." Ruth smiled at the compliment, though worry shadowed her expression. "I keep wondering if I'm preparing enough. What if I don't know how to care for a baby? What if something goes wrong during the birth? Then we'll figure it out together," Cal replied with the calm certainty that had become one of his most reassuring qualities. "You've got good instincts, Ruth. I've seen how you care for things, the way you tend your garden, how you looked after me when I was half frozen. This won't be different." The confidence in his voice helped settle some of Ruth's anxiety. Over the past 2 weeks, Cal had proved himself a man of steady competence, someone who approached problems with practical solutions rather than worry. He'd found work with Jonas Müller, a German immigrant whose farm lay 3 miles east of town, and had quickly established himself as reliable help with livestock and repairs. "Jonas is pleased with your work," Ruth said, returning to her sewing. "Sarah mentioned it when she visited yesterday." Sarah Müller had been Ruth's first genuine visitor since the wedding, a small woman with graying braids and kind eyes who'd arrived with fresh bread and a complete disregard for Millfield's social conventions. She'd spent an hour examining Ruth's sewing project, offering advice about baby care with the authority of someone who'd raised 6 children to adulthood. "Sarah's good people," Cal agreed. "So is Jonas. They're not quick to judge, which seems rare around here." "They know what it's like to be outsiders," Ruth replied, thinking of the Mullers' struggle to establish themselves in a community suspicious of foreigners. "Perhaps that makes them more willing to give others the benefit of the doubt." Cal nodded, but Ruth noticed the way his attention had shifted to the window, where the view showed the first signs of what promised to be a challenging summer. The usual spring rains had been light, and the grass already showed patches of brown despite the early season. If the pattern continued, the autumn harvest would suffer, and winter would test everyone's reserves. "Jonas is worried about the weather," Cal said, confirming Ruth's thoughts. "Says he's never seen the ground this dry so early in the year." "Father always said Kansas weather was God's way of keeping settlers humble," Ruth replied, though she felt her own concern growing. "A bad harvest year means everyone suffers, not just the farmers. Which is why I'm grateful he's keeping me on through the summer, even if work gets scarce." Cal's expression grew serious. I know people are still talking about us, about me. Having steady employment helps, but it'll take time to build real trust. Ruth understood the delicate nature of Cal's position in the community. As her husband, he'd gained a certain legitimacy, but he remained an outsider with no family connections or long-standing reputation to vouch for his character. Every interaction was a test, every day an opportunity to prove himself worthy of the community's grudging acceptance. Ezra Blackwood stopped by the mercantile while I was there yesterday, Ruth said carefully. He asked Henrik about your background, where you came from. Cal's hands stilled on the baby gown he'd been examining. What did Henrik tell him? That a man's past was his own business, and his present actions spoke louder than old gossip. Ruth met Cal's eyes directly. But Ezra's the type to keep digging until he finds something worth talking about. The silence that followed carried weight. Ruth had learned to read Cal's moods over the past weeks, and she recognized the careful stillness that came over him whenever the conversation touched on his life before arriving at her door. He'd shared stories about his mother, mentioned work on various ranches, but the details remained vague, and certain topics caused him to grow distant. Ruth, Cal said finally, there are things about my past that might cause problems if they came to light. I've never lied to you, but I haven't told you everything either. Are you in trouble with the law? Not exactly, but there are people who might see it differently. Cal's voice carried the careful tone of a man choosing his words with precision. I killed a man in Texas. It was self-defense, clear as day to anyone who was there, but the man I killed had friends who saw things differently. Ruth felt her sewing drop into her lap as the implications settled over her. Is that why you had that horse? Why you were traveling in such weather? I was trying to stay ahead of people who wanted revenge more than justice. Cal's grey eyes held steady on hers. The bridle belonged to a horse I borrowed from men who were trying to kill me. I figured the owner would rather lose a horse than lose his life defending it. The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either support deeper trust or collapse under the weight of revelation. Ruth found herself studying Cal's face, looking for signs of deception or violence, but finding only the same steady honesty that had characterized all their interactions. Were you really defending yourself? She asked. A man named Pike Garrett came at me with a knife outside a saloon in Abilene. He was drunk, angry about money he'd lost in a card game he thought I'd cheated at. I hadn't, but Pike wasn't interested in hearing explanations. Cal's voice remained level, matter-of-fact. I tried to walk away. He followed. When he lunged with the knife, I hit him harder than I meant to. He fell, struck his head on the edge of a water trough, and never got up. And his friends blamed you. Pike had a brother who wore a sheriff's badge, and 2 cousins who believed family loyalty mattered more than truth. They decided I was guilty of murder and set about proving it their own way. Cal's smile held no humor. Turned out leaving town quickly was healthier than staying to argue my case in their court. Ruth absorbed this information, weighing it against everything she'd learned about Cal's character over the past weeks. He'd shown nothing but gentleness in his dealings with her patience with her moods and fears, consideration for her comfort and needs. The idea that he was capable of violence seemed to contradict everything she'd observed. But then again, she thought about her own capacity for actions she'd never imagined possible. Opening her door to a stranger, agreeing to marry a man she'd known for hours, defending choices that flew in the face of everything she'd been taught about proper behavior. Desperate circumstances could reveal hidden strengths, just as they could expose hidden darkness. Do you think these men might follow you here? She asked. I've been careful to cover my trail, and Kansas is a long way from Texas, but I can't. He promised they won't eventually find me. Cal's honesty was both reassuring and terrifying. If they do, I'll handle it. I won't let my past bring danger to you or the baby. Ruth placed a protective hand on her belly, feeling the child stir as if responding to her tension. The life growing inside her had already faced so many uncertainties, an absent father, community judgment, economic hardship. Now she had to consider the possibility of physical danger as well. "What would you do if they came here?" she asked. "Leave," Cal said without hesitation. "Disappear before they could connect me to you. A woman with a child needs stability, not a husband who brings violence to her door." The certainty in his voice told Ruth that Cal had already considered this possibility, had made his decision about how to protect her, even at the cost of their new life together. The knowledge should have frightened her, but instead she felt a strange comfort in understanding that her welfare mattered more to him than his own safety. "I hope it doesn't come to that," she said quietly. "So do I," Cal replied. "But I wanted you to know the truth. You deserve to understand what you've gotten yourself into by marrying me." Ruth looked down at the baby clothes scattered across her bed, then back at Cal's earnest face. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but something deeper had begun to grow between them. Trust, respect, perhaps even the beginnings of genuine affection. The revelation of his past complicated things, but it didn't change the fundamental decency she'd seen in him every day since their wedding. "We all have things in our past we'd rather forget," she said finally. "The question is whether we let those things define who we are now, or whether we choose to become something better." Cal's expression softened, and he reached out to cover her hand with his. "You're a remarkable woman, Ruth Danner." The warmth in his voice, the gentle pressure of his fingers, the sound of her new name spoken with such respect, all of it combined to create a moment of connection that felt more intimate than anything they'd shared before. Ruth found herself looking at Cal, not as the stranger who'd saved her from exile, but as the man who'd chosen to build a life with her, despite the complications they both carried. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered across the prairie with the dry sound of a summer that promised to test everyone's endurance. But inside their small cabin, two people were discovering that trust, like love, could grow in the most unlikely circumstances, taking root in the smallest acts of faith and flourishing despite the harsh ground in which it was planted. The baby kicked against Ruth's ribs, and she smiled, imagining a future where the small clothes in her sewing basket would wrap a child who'd know both parents' love, regardless of how that love had begun or what challenges it might face. Some of the most beautiful things, she reflected, grew in the harshest conditions. By late June, the community water well had dropped 3 feet, and Millfield's weekly meetings had taken on the grim tenor of a war council. Ruth sat in the back row of the chapel, her hands folded over her 8-month belly, listening to Judge Harwell outline water rationing procedures with the methodical precision of a man who'd seen frontier communities survive and die based on such decisions. "Each household will be allotted 2 buckets per day," the judge announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed building. "Priority goes to drinking, cooking, and livestock in that order. Gardens and other non-essential uses are suspended until further notice." A murmur of discontent rippled through the assembled townspeople. Margaret Harwell raised her hand with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Judge, what about the laundry? Sanitation is hardly non-essential, especially with the heat we're experiencing." "Community wash days will be organized," Dr. Walsh interjected from his seat near the front. "Shared resources, shared labor. We'll have to adapt our habits to match our circumstances." Ruth felt the baby shift restlessly within her, perhaps responding to her own tension. The child was due within the month, and the prospect of giving birth during a water shortage added another layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming situation. Beside her, Cal sat with the alertness of a man accustomed to evaluating threats, his grey eyes moving between speakers as he absorbed information about their community's survival strategies. "There's another matter we need to discuss," Jonas Muller said, rising from his seat near the middle of the chapel. His German accent made some words harder to catch, but his meaning was clear enough. "The wells on the outlying farms are failing faster than those in town. If this continues, we may need to think about consolidation." Consolidation. Big Jim Sullivan's voice boomed from the back corner, where he'd positioned himself near the door as if ready to flee. "You talking about abandoning the farms?" "I'm talking about survival," Jonas replied calmly. "My well dropped 2 feet in the past week. Cal Danner and I have been digging deeper, but we're hitting hardpan. Without rain soon, we'll need to consider whether scattered homesteads can be sustained." Ruth noticed the way several heads turned toward Cal when Jonas mentioned his name, some with curiosity, others with the guarded assessment that had become familiar since his arrival. Her husband had worked tirelessly over the past month, earning respect through competence and reliability, but she could see that full acceptance remained elusive. "What do you recommend, Muller?" Judge Harwell asked. "Shared resources," Jonas replied. "Pool our water, our labor, our knowledge. Those with failing wells move closer to reliable sources. Work together instead of struggling alone. That's all." "Well and good in theory," Ezra Blackwood interjected, his voice carrying the skeptical tone Ruth had learned to associate with resistance to change. "But what about property rights? What about people who've invested everything in their land? What about staying alive?" Cal spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice cutting through the chapel's humid air with quiet authority. "I've seen drought before, down in Texas. Communities that adapt survive, those that don't." He let the implication hang unfinished. Ruth felt a surge of pride watching her husband address the assembly. Despite being the newcomer, the outsider, Cal commanded attention through his evident experience and measured words. She could see others leaning forward to hear him better, and even Ezra Blackwood's expression showed grudging attention. "What exactly are you suggesting, Danner?" Judge Harwell asked. Cal stood, his height and broad shoulders making him impossible to ignore. "Form work crews to dig deeper wells where there's still hope of finding water. Share the labor, share the resources. Those with good wells help those without. Set up temporary shelters near the most reliable water sources for families whose homesteads are too far from sustainable supplies." "And who's going to organize all this cooperation?" Margaret Harwell's question carried a note of challenge. "Who's going to decide who sacrifices and who benefits?" "We all decide," Cal replied simply. "We all sacrifice. We all benefit, or we all lose everything." Ruth watched the faces around her as Cal's words sank in. She could see the conflict in their expressions, the desire for self-preservation warring with the recognition that individual survival might require collective action. These were people who'd come to Kansas believing in the promise of independence, of making their own way through individual effort and determination. The idea of pooling resources and surrendering autonomy challenged fundamental assumptions about frontier life. Dr. Walsh cleared his throat. "There's another consideration. Medical needs during this crisis. Mrs. Danner here is approaching her confinement, and there may be others who require significant water resources for health-related issues." The mention of her condition made Ruth acutely aware of the attention focused on her. She felt her cheeks warm as eyes turned in her direction, some sympathetic, others calculating. In a community facing water rationing, a birth represented both new life and additional demand on precious resources. "The Danner cabin has a reliable well," Cal said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that suggested carefully controlled emotion. "Ruth and I are willing to share our water with anyone who needs it for medical purposes." The offer surprised Ruth, though she realized it shouldn't have. Cal's generosity with resources he couldn't spare had become one of his defining characteristics. Still, the public declaration committed them to sacrifices they hadn't discussed. Privately, "That's generous," Judge Harwell acknowledged, "but we need systematic solutions, not individual charity." "Then let's be systematic," Jonas Muller said, standing again. "I propose we form a water committee, representatives from town and the outlying farms, make decisions together, enforce rationing fairly, organize work crews for well digging." "Who serves on this committee?" Big Jim Sullivan asked. "Volunteers," Cal said before anyone else could respond. "People willing to put community survival ahead of personal convenience." Ruth saw the subtle challenge in Cal's words, the way he was testing the community's commitment to cooperation over self-interest. She also noticed how several people shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing themselves in his description of those who prioritized personal convenience. Judge Harwell nodded slowly. All in favor of forming a water committee with representatives from both town and outlying areas. Hands rose throughout the chapel, though Ruth noticed some hesitation, some reluctance. The vote carried easily, but she could see the divisions. That would make implementation challenging. Excellent, the judge continued. Now who's willing to serve? Jonas Muller's hand went up immediately, followed by Dr. Walsh's. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret Harwell raised hers as well. Ruth wasn't surprised when Cal's hand joined theirs, though she noticed the way some eyes followed his movement with expressions she couldn't quite read. Anyone else? Judge Harwell asked. Silence stretched through the chapel until Henrik from the mercantile slowly raised his hand. Someone needs to speak for the business interests, he said. Make sure commerce doesn't collapse along with the wells. 5 committee members, Ruth noted, an odd number to prevent deadlocks, representing various community interests. She found herself cautiously optimistic that these particular people might be able to work together effectively. The committee will meet tomorrow morning at 9, Judge Harwell announced. Anyone with suggestions or concerns should speak with one of the representatives. As the meeting broke up, Ruth struggled to her feet with Cal's assistance. The baby had grown heavy in recent weeks, and the heat inside the packed chapel had left her feeling drained. Several people approached them as they made their way toward the door, offering words of support for Cal's committee service or asking about Ruth's due date with the kind of interest that frontier communities showed for significant events. Sarah Mueller appeared at Ruth's elbow with a cup of water drawn from the chapel's reserves. "Drink this," she instructed in her practical way. "The heat is dangerous for women in your condition." Ruth accepted the water gratefully, noting how Sarah didn't ask permission or wait for politeness. The older woman had become a fierce ally over the past month, offering advice and assistance with the confidence of someone who'd survived multiple pregnancies and frontier challenges. "Your husband spoke well today," Sarah continued, glancing toward Cal, who was deep in conversation with Jonas about well-digging techniques. "He understands what's at stake. Sometimes I think he understands it better than the rest of us," Ruth replied. "He's seen what happens when communities can't work together. Experience has value, even when it comes from hard places." Sarah's eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd learned difficult lessons herself. People will learn to trust him, given time. Ruth hoped Sarah was right, but she could see the careful way some townspeople still regarded Cal, the subtle distance that marked him as an outsider despite his growing contributions to community welfare. Trust, like water in a drought, was a precious resource that couldn't be forced or rushed. As they walked home through the dusty streets, Cal reached for Ruth's hand, providing the support she needed to navigate the uneven ground. His palm was calloused from weeks of manual labor, warm and steady against hers. "Are you sure about offering our water to others?" Ruth asked when they were out of earshot of their neighbors. "Are you having second thoughts?" Ruth considered the question seriously. Their well remained reliable, but if the drought continued, even their reserves might prove inadequate. The baby would need clean water for drinking and washing, and her own recovery from childbirth would require resources they might not have to spare. "I'm thinking about practical realities," she said finally, "about what we might need in the coming months." "So am I," Cal replied. "I'm thinking about the kind of community we want our child to grow up in. One where people help each other through hard times, or one where neighbors watch each other struggle and do nothing." Ruth squeezed his hand, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't just about water or drought or survival. It was about the kind of people they wanted to be, the kind of legacy they wanted to leave for their child. In a place where individual success often came at the expense of community welfare, Cal was choosing to invest in collective survival. "You're right," she said. "Besides, if we're going to face whatever's coming, we're better off facing it together." Cal smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "That's what I love about you, Ruth Danner. You understand what matters." The casual mention of love stopped Ruth in her tracks, her heart suddenly racing despite her physical exhaustion. Cal seemed to realize what he'd said at the same moment, his expression shifting to something between surprise and uncertainty. They stood in the middle of Millfield's main street, dust swirling around their feet, while the weight of unexpected emotion settled between them. Ruth found herself searching Cal's face, looking for signs of whether his words had been deliberate or simply the kind of casual affection that developed between people who'd shared difficult circumstances. "Ruth," Cal said quietly. I know," she interrupted, not certain she was ready to hear whatever he'd been about to say. "I understand." But as they continued toward home, Ruth found herself wondering if understanding was enough, or if something deeper was growing between them. Something that might prove as essential to their survival as the water they'd promised to share with their neighbors. The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly, promising another day of heat and another step closer to whatever crisis awaited their small community. But for the first time in months, Ruth felt a sense of hope that they might weather the storm ahead, not just as individuals struggling to survive, but as partners building something worth preserving. The wanted poster arrived on a Tuesday morning. In July, carried by a man who introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison and spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Ruth first noticed him from her kitchen window, where she'd been preparing preserves from the last of their fruit, before the heat spoiled everything. The stranger sat his horse with military precision outside Henrik's mercantile, his dust-covered, coat and weathered hat, marking him as someone who'd traveled far and hard to reach Millfield. Ruth's hands stilled on the jar she'd been sealing as an inexplicable dread settled in her chest. 8.5 months pregnant, she'd grown heavy and slow, but her instincts remained sharp enough to recognize trouble when it rode into town. Cal was at the Mueller farm, working on their latest attempt to dig a deeper well. The water committee had organized 3 crews to work in rotation, and Cal had volunteered for the dawn shift that started before the day's heat became unbearable. He wouldn't return until evening, which meant Ruth faced whatever this stranger represented alone. She watched through her window as Deputy Morrison dismounted and entered the mercantile, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered, the kind of curious assembly that formed whenever anything unusual happened, in a place where novelty was rare and often unwelcome. Ruth debated staying inside, but her pregnancy had made her restless, and the cabin felt stifling in the summer heat. Against her better judgment, she made her way slowly into town, her hand pressed to her lower back, where a persistent ache had been building for days. By the time she reached the mercantile, Deputy Morrison had tacked his poster to the board beside Henrik's door, where notices about land sales and community meetings usually appeared. The crowd around it spoke in hushed tones, and Ruth felt her stomach clench when she saw several people glance in her direction with expressions that ranged from pity to speculation. She pushed through the small gathering, her pregnant bulk providing an advantage in claiming space, and found herself staring at a crude but recognizable drawing of her husband's face. The text below the image was printed in bold letters that seemed to shout their accusation from the weathered paper: "Wanted for murder, Calvin James Danner, age approximately 30, height 6 feet 2 inches, weight 180 pounds, light brown hair, gray, eyes dangerous, armed, and extremely hostile. Reward $500 dead or alive. Contact Sheriff Wade Garrett, Abilene, Texas." Ruth's vision blurred at the edges as the words sank in. $500, more money than most people in Millfield saw in 2 years. The poster made Cal sound like a vicious killer, a man who posed a threat to anyone who encountered him. Nothing in the crude description matched the gentle husband who carved wooden crosses and worried about her comfort during the difficult final weeks of pregnancy. "That's quite a reward," Deputy Morrison said quietly, moving to stand beside Ruth. He was a lean man with pale eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested coiled energy, enough to tempt a person into overlooking their neighborly obligations. Ruth forced herself to look at the deputy directly. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do, Mrs. Danner." Morrison's voice carried no accusation, just the patient tone of someone who'd dealt with similar situations before. "Calvin Danner is your husband, isn't he?" The crowd around them had grown quiet, though Ruth could feel their attention like heat from a forge. Every word of this conversation would be repeated throughout Millfield before sunset, analyzed and debated and embellished until the truth became whatever served the storyteller's purposes. "Yes," Ruth said, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster. "He is. Then you should know he's wanted for killing a man in Texas. Sheriff Wade Garrett has been tracking him for the better part of 2 years. Morrison's pale eyes never left her face. "Garrett's a determined man. He doesn't give up easy when it comes to family." "Family? The man your husband killed was Garrett's brother, Pike Garrett. Sheriff's been hunting Calvin Danner ever since, and he's authorized me to bring him back to face justice." Ruth felt the baby shift within her, perhaps responding to her racing heartbeat. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for details about the drama unfolding in their midst. She recognized faces she'd known since childhood, neighbors who'd watched her grow up, people who'd attended her father's sermons, women who'd helped her mother with church suppers. Now they stared at her with the fascinated horror of people watching a public execution. "What proof do you have that my husband is the man you're looking for?" Ruth asked, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a second paper, this one bearing official seals and signatures. "Witness statements, physical descriptions that match. And this." He unfolded the document to reveal a detailed account of the fight outside the Abilene saloon, complete with testimony from 3 people who'd watched Pike Garrett die. Ruth read the statements with growing dismay. The witnesses painted Cal as the aggressor, a card cheat who'd killed Pike Garrett in cold blood when confronted about his dishonesty. According to their version of events, Cal had started the fight, had shown no mercy when Pike fell, and had fled like a coward when others tried to intervene. Nothing in their description matched the story Cal had told her about defending himself against a drunken man with a knife. "These witnesses," Ruth said slowly, "they wouldn't happen to be related to Sheriff Garrett, would they?" Something that might have been respect flickered in Morrison's pale eyes. "You're asking the right questions, Mrs. Danner, but it doesn't change the facts. Your husband is wanted for murder, and I'm here to take him back to face trial. What if he's innocent? Then a jury will determine that." Morrison's voice remained neutral, professional. "My job is to find him and bring him back. Justice is someone else's responsibility." Ruth looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing the conflict in their expressions. These people had begun to accept Cal, had seen his contributions to their community, had watched him work tirelessly to help them survive the drought. But $500 was a fortune on the frontier, and the poster made him sound like a dangerous criminal who deceived them all. "Where is he now?" Morrison asked. Ruth's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby had grown still. "Working. He'll be back this evening. I'll wait." Morrison tipped his hat with formal courtesy. "Mrs. Danner, I want you to know I take no pleasure in this, but the law is the law, and Sheriff Garrett has legal authority to demand your husband's return." The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama passed, but Ruth could see people clustering in small groups, their voices low and urgent as they discussed this development. She recognized the signs of a community in crisis, torn between loyalty to someone who'd proved his worth and the law's demands for justice. Henrik appeared at her elbow with a cup of water and the kind of gentle attention he'd shown her since childhood. "Come inside, Ruth. You shouldn't be standing in this heat." Ruth accepted his guidance gratefully, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. The mercantile's interior felt cool and dim after the harsh sunlight, and Henrik settled her into the chair he kept for elderly customers who needed to rest while shopping. "Henrik," she said quietly, "what do you think people will do?" The old shopkeeper was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands arranging items on his counter with unnecessary precision. "People are scared, Ruth. The drought's got everyone on edge, and now this. Some folks will see that reward money as a way out of their troubles, and others remember how Cal's been working to help everyone survive this summer. Remember how he's treated you, how he's conducted himself since he got here." Henrik's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen communities tested before. "But if fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally consider." Ruth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. If she warned Cal, he could run, disappear into the vast emptiness of the prairie before Morrison could arrest him. But that would make her an accessory to his escape, and it would leave her to face the aftermath alone with a newborn child. If she said nothing, Cal would walk into Morrison's trap that evening, and she might never see him again. "Mrs. Danner." Morrison appeared in the mercantile's doorway, his silhouette dark against the bright street. "I hope you understand that attempting to warn your husband or help him escape would make you an accomplice to his crimes." "I understand," Ruth replied, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. "Good. I'd hate for this situation to become more complicated than it already is." After Morrison left, Ruth sat in Henrik's chair and stared at her hands, while her mind raced through possibilities and consequences. The baby stirred restlessly, and she realized that her own distress was affecting the child. She needed to stay calm, to think clearly, to make decisions based on facts rather than emotions. But what were the facts? Cal had told her he'd killed a man in self-defense. The wanted poster suggested premeditated murder. Someone was lying, but Ruth had no way to determine who. What she did know was that Cal had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. He'd married her to save her from exile, had worked tirelessly to support their family, had proven himself a valuable member of their community. Whatever had happened in Texas, the man she'd married was not the vicious killer described on Morrison's poster. The question was whether anyone else would see it that way when money and legal authority were involved. As the afternoon wore on, Ruth made her decision. She would tell Cal about Morrison's arrival, about the poster and the accusations. She would give him the choice about what to do next, whether to run or stay and face whatever justice awaited him. But she would also prepare herself for the possibility that by evening she might be a widow, carrying a child whose father was either dead or imprisoned hundreds of miles away. The thought terrified her more than any physical danger she'd ever faced, because it forced her to confront a truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. Somewhere in the practical arrangement of their marriage, she'd fallen in love with Cal Danner. And love, she was learning, made every choice infinitely more complicated. Ruth waited until the sun hung low over the western horizon before she retrieved her father's shotgun from its place above the cabin door. The old hunting rifle hadn't been fired in over a year, not since her father had taken his last unsuccessful hunt for winter meat. But the weight of it in her hands provided a comfort that had nothing to do with its practical utility. She checked the breech methodically, her father's lessons from childhood coming back despite her trembling fingers. 2 shells, both old but still solid, enough for whatever confrontation the evening might bring. The baby had been restless all afternoon, responding to her elevated heartbeat and the tension that seemed to radiate from every muscle in her body. Ruth placed one hand on her swollen belly, while the other gripped the shotgun's worn stock and whispered a prayer that had more to do with courage than safety. "Just a little longer," she murmured to the child. "Stay put just a little longer, and then we'll figure out what comes next." Through her window, she could see Deputy Morrison sitting in the shade beside the general store, his horse tethered nearby and his hat pulled low over his eyes. He'd positioned himself where he could watch the road that led to the Mueller farm, patient as a hawk watching for prey. The sight of him made Ruth's stomach clench with a mixture of anger and fear. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the evening air, and Ruth's heart began racing despite her efforts to remain calm. Cal rode into view astride Jonas Mueller's borrowed mare, his shirt dark with sweat and his face showing the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 12 hours digging in the Kansas heat. Even from a distance, Ruth could see the satisfaction in his posture. The well crew had finally struck water at 30 feet, providing the Mueller farm with the reliable source they desperately needed. Cal would be coming home with good news, expecting to share a quiet evening with his pregnant wife. Instead, he was riding into a trap that could destroy everything they'd built together. Ruth stepped onto her porch with the shotgun cradled in her arms, the weapon's presence immediately. Drawing Morrison's attention, the deputy straightened in his chair, but made no move toward his own gun, perhaps recognizing that a heavily pregnant woman posed no immediate threat to his mission. "Cal," Ruth called as her husband guided the mare toward their small barn. "We have a visitor." Cal's head turned toward Morrison, and Ruth watched recognition dawn in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the weary acceptance of a man who'd been expecting this moment for 2 years. He dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and walked toward the cabin with his hands visible and his eyes fixed on the "Deputy Marshal." "Marshal," Cal said quietly, stopping about 10 feet from where Morrison now stood. "Didn't expect you to find me this far north." "Your trail went cold in Colorado," Morrison replied, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Took some time to pick it up again. You covered your tracks well, not well enough apparently." Ruth watched the exchange with growing dread, noting the careful politeness that masked the deadly seriousness of the situation. Both men understood the stakes, understood that this conversation would end with Cal either dead, captured, or forced to run again. "I've got a warrant for your arrest, Calvin Danner," Morrison continued, reaching into his coat to withdraw the official document. "For the murder of Pike Garrett in Abilene, Texas. You'll need to come with me. And if I refuse—" Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. "Then I'll have to insist." Ruth stepped forward, the shotgun's weight giving her courage she didn't naturally possess. "Deputy Morrison, my husband told me about what happened in Abilene. He said it was self-defense." "That's for a jury to decide, ma'am." Morrison's eyes never left Cal, though his voice remained respectful. "My job is just to bring him back. To a sheriff who's the dead man's brother." Ruth's voice carried more strength than she'd expected. "Back to witnesses who are all related to the Garrett family? What kind of justice is that?" "It's the law, Mrs. Danner, and the law doesn't pick sides based on family connections." Cal laughed, the sound bitter as winter wind. "Tell that to Sheriff Wade Garrett. Tell that to the cousins who swore I started that fight when everyone in the saloon saw Pike come at me with a knife." "You got witnesses say different?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I had witnesses. 3 of them decided leaving town was healthier than testifying against a sheriff's family. The 4th one changed his story after someone had a conversation with him." Ruth felt a contraction grip her belly, sharp and sudden enough to make her gasp. The shotgun wavered in her hands as she struggled to maintain her balance, and both men turned toward her with immediate concern. "Ruth?" Cal took a step in her direction, then stopped when Morrison's hand moved to his gun. "I'm fine," Ruth said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The pain faded after a moment, but she could feel something changing in her body. A shift that suggested the baby had decided to make its appearance, regardless of the crisis unfolding around them. "Maybe we should continue this discussion inside," Morrison suggested, perhaps recognizing that a birth might complicate his mission. "No," Ruth said firmly. "Whatever happens here, it happens in the open where people can see it." As if summoned by her words, neighbors began appearing along the street. Sarah Mueller emerged from the direction of town, her arms full of medical supplies that suggested someone had told her about Ruth's condition. Jonas followed close behind, his weathered face grave with concern. Dr. Walsh appeared from his office 2 blocks away, his black bag in hand, and his expression suggesting he'd been expecting this call. Soon a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the same curiosity that attended any dramatic event in a small community. Ruth recognized most of the faces, people who'd known her since childhood, who'd watched her father preach, and her mother organize church suppers, who'd seen her fall from grace and marry a stranger to avoid exile. Now they would witness whatever resolution her story was destined to have. Another contraction hit, stronger than the first, and Ruth doubled over with a cry she couldn't suppress. The shotgun slipped from her hands and clattered onto the porch, its discharge mechanism safely engaged, but the sound of its falling like a gunshot in the evening air. "The baby's coming," Sarah Muller announced, pushing through the crowd with the authority of someone who'd attended dozens of births. "Dr. Walsh, we need to get her inside immediately." "No," Ruth gasped, struggling to straighten. "Not until this is settled." "Mrs. Danner," Morrison said quietly, "your medical needs take priority over my warrant. I can wait. Can you?" Ruth's voice carried a challenge born of desperation and pain. "Can you wait while the whole town watches? While people remember that Cal Danner helped them survive this drought? While they decide whether $500 is worth betraying a neighbor who's proven his character?" Morrison's eyes moved across the assembled crowd, perhaps noting the expressions on their faces. Ruth saw the conflict there, fear of the law warring with respect for Cal's contributions to their community, financial desperation competing with basic human decency. "Ruth, please," Cal said, his voice tight with worry. "Go inside. Let Dr. Walsh take care of you. I'll handle this." "How?" Ruth demanded, another contraction building in her lower back. "How will you handle a deputy marshal with a legal warrant and a gun?" Cal's silence provided her answer. He would surrender, would allow himself to be taken back to Texas to face a jury stacked against him, because the alternative was violence that might endanger her and their unborn child. "There's another way," Jonas Muller said, stepping forward from the crowd. The German farmer's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to solving problems through careful thought rather than quick action. "Deputy Morrison, you said you need to bring Cal back to face justice, but what if justice could be served here?" "I don't follow your meaning. Judge Harwell has legal authority in this territory. What if we held a hearing here now, with testimony from people who've seen Cal's character firsthand?" Jonas's suggestion carried the desperate innovation of someone trying to find a third option where only 2 had seemed to exist. Ruth felt hope flutter in her chest, even as another contraction began building. "Would that satisfy your warrant?" Morrison considered the question with the careful attention of someone weighing legal technicalities against practical realities. A territorial judge can't overturn a Texas murder charge. But if new evidence came to light that suggested the original warrant was based on false testimony, then the charges might be dropped. Judge Harwell finished, appearing at the edge of the crowd with the measured pace of someone who'd been watching the situation develop. "Deputy Morrison, I'm willing to convene an emergency hearing if you're willing to participate." Ruth saw Morrison's hesitation, understood the impossible position he'd been placed in. He had legal authority to arrest Cal, but he also had a community of armed citizens who'd grown to respect the man he was trying to take away. The $500 reward might tempt some individuals, but collective action required different calculations. "Mrs. Danner needs medical attention," Dr. Walsh interjected, his professional concern overriding the legal drama. "If we're going to do this, it needs to happen quickly." Another contraction gripped Ruth, stronger than any before, and she felt something shift decisively within her. The baby was coming whether the legal questions were resolved or not, and her child would be born into whatever world the next few hours created. "Very well," Morrison said finally. "I'll participate in Judge Harwell's hearing. but I want it understood that if the evidence doesn't satisfy me, I'm taking Cal Danner back to Texas. And I want it understood, Cal replied quietly, that if you try to take me after my child is born, you'll have to go through me first. The challenge hung in the evening air like the promise of a storm, and Ruth realized that everything they'd built together, their marriage, their place in the community, their hopes for the future, would be decided in the next few hours. She gripped Sarah Muller's steady hand and prepared to bring their child into a world where love and law would finally have to choose which one mattered more. Ruth's labor began in earnest as Judge Harwell transformed her front porch into an impromptu courtroom, with Deputy Morrison standing to one side like an executioner waiting for his moment, and Cal positioned near enough to reach her if needed, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. Dr. Walsh had commandeered her bedroom, laying out his instruments and supplies, while Sarah Miller boiled water on the kitchen stove with the efficient movements of someone who'd attended births. In far worse circumstances, "The hearing will proceed as follows," Judge Harwell announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the formal authority that had settled disputes across 3 counties for the past decade. "Deputy Morrison will present the charges against Calvin Danner. Mr. Danner will have opportunity to respond. Witnesses may speak if they have relevant testimony to offer." Ruth gripped the porch railing as another contraction built, fighting to focus on the legal proceedings despite the increasingly urgent demands of her body. The baby was coming fast. Too fast, according to Dr. Walsh's grim assessment, and she found herself caught between 2 kinds of pain that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Mrs. Danner should be inside," Morrison said quietly, perhaps recognizing that conducting a murder hearing while a woman gave birth stretched the boundaries of civilized procedure. "I stay here," Ruth gasped between contractions. "This concerns my husband, my child's father. I have a right to hear it." Cal's jaw tightened with visible emotion, but he remained where Judge Harwell had positioned him, understanding that any sudden movement might provoke Morrison into drawing his weapon. The deputy marshal had shown admirable restraint so far, but $500 and a legal warrant created pressures that could turn deadly without warning. "Proceed with the charges," Judge Harwell instructed. Morrison withdrew the official warrant, unfolding it with ceremony that lent weight to his words. "Calvin James Danner is charged with the murder of Pike Garrett in Abilene, Texas, on the night of September 15, 1870. Witnesses state that Danner started a fight over accusations of card cheating, then killed Garrett when the deceased attempted to defend himself. And these witnesses?" Judge Harwell asked. "Tom Garrett and Billy Garrett, cousins of the deceased. Frank Morrison, no relation to myself, who was tending bar that night." Ruth noticed the careful way Morrison presented the witness list, mentioning the family connections as if they strengthened rather than compromised the testimony. She also noticed how the crowd shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the obvious bias in having a dead man's relatives serve as the primary witnesses against his killer. "Mr. Danner," Judge Harwell continued, "how do you respond to these charges?" Cal straightened, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled townspeople. "I deny them, Your Honor. Pike Garrett came at me with a knife when I tried to leave the saloon. He was drunk, angry about money he'd lost in a fair game, and looking for someone to blame. I defended myself. His death was an accident. He fell and struck his head when I pushed him away. You have witnesses to support this version of events?" "I did. 3 men who saw the whole thing. But Tom Garrett and his cousins convinced them that leaving town would be healthier than testifying against a sheriff's family." Another contraction hit Ruth with enough force to make her cry out, the sound cutting through the legal proceedings like a blade. Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, with blood on his hands and concern etched deep in his weathered features. "Judge, I need to take Mrs. Danner inside immediately. The baby's presentation is unusual, and she's losing blood." "No," Ruth said through gritted teeth. "Not until this is finished." "Ruth," Cal said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "please." "Let Dr. Walsh help you," "They'll take you away," Ruth gasped. "The moment I'm not here to see it, they'll take you away, and I'll never know what happened." Sarah Mueller appeared beside Dr. Walsh, her practical assessment cutting through the emotional tension. "We can move her to the porch if necessary." "She's right about timing. The baby won't wait for legal proceedings." Judge Harwell looked between Ruth's determined face and Dr. Walsh's medical concern, clearly torn between humanitarian considerations and the demands of frontier justice. "Very well. We'll continue, but quickly. Deputy Morrison, do you have additional evidence beyond witness testimony?" Morrison hesitated, perhaps recognizing the weakness of his case when presented to people who'd watched Cal's character over the past months. The witnesses were consistent in their accounts. Garrett family members wouldn't lie about their own kin's death, wouldn't they? Jonas Mueller stepped forward, his German accent giving weight to his words. "I have seen what families do when grief and anger cloud their judgment. I have seen how people convince themselves that revenge is justice." "You weren't there," Morrison replied. "You don't know what happened." "No, but I know what has happened here," Jonas continued. "I know Cal Danner worked 16-hour days to help us find water when our wells failed. I know he shared his own resources when others were in need. I know he married a woman who needed protection and has treated her with nothing but respect and kindness." The crowd murmured agreement, and Ruth felt a surge of hope despite the increasing urgency of her labor. These people had seen Cal's true character, had witnessed his contributions to their community's survival. Perhaps their testimony would carry enough weight to counter the accusations from Texas. "Character witnesses are all well and good," Morrison said, "but they don't change what happened in Abilene, don't they?" Dr. Walsh had returned with clean towels and a grimly professional expression. "Deputy, in my medical experience, I've learned that patterns of behavior rarely change dramatically. A man who's gentle with his pregnant wife, who works tirelessly to help his neighbors, who shows compassion for the vulnerable, that man doesn't sound like someone who'd commit cold-blooded murder." Ruth felt something shift inside her, both physically and emotionally. The baby was coming now, regardless of legal proceedings or community testimony, and she found herself thinking about the quilt Sarah Mueller had brought. Pieces of different fabrics sewn together to create something beautiful and functional. "Sarah," she gasped, "the baby blanket, the quilt you made." Sarah nodded, understanding, and disappeared into the cabin, returning moments later with a small quilt sewn from scraps, donated by various community members. Ruth recognized pieces of her mother's old dress, fabric from Sarah's kitchen curtains, even a corner torn from one of Cal's work shirts. "This is what community looks like," Ruth said, holding up the quilt despite another contraction. "Different pieces, different backgrounds, but sewn together into something stronger than any individual part." Judge Harwell studied the quilt, perhaps understanding the metaphor Ruth was trying to construct. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Danner has become part of this community's fabric?" "I'm suggesting that people can change," Ruth replied. "That who someone is today matters more than who they might have been yesterday." Morrison's expression softened slightly, though his professional obligations remained unchanged. "Mrs. Danner, I appreciate what you're saying, but I still have a legal warrant to execute." "Then execute it," Cal said quietly, stepping forward with his hands extended. "Take me back to Texas, but know that you're taking an innocent man to face a corrupt sheriff's idea of justice." "Cal, no." Ruth started to protest, but another contraction cut off her words. "If I don't go willingly, people might get hurt," Cal continued, his eyes moving to encompass the armed townspeople who'd gathered to witness the proceedings. "I won't be responsible for violence that endangers innocent folks." Ruth watched her husband prepare to sacrifice himself for the safety of others, and felt something fierce and protective rise within her, not just maternal instinct for her unborn child, but the complex love of a woman who'd finally found a man worth fighting for. "Deputy Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying despite the pain, What if I told you I had new evidence? Something that might change your understanding of what happened in Abilene. Morrison turned toward her with sharp attention. What kind of evidence? Ruth smiled despite her agony, remembering a conversation from weeks earlier that had seemed unimportant at the time. Cal told me he carved something on Pike Garrett's knife before he left Abilene. Something that would prove Pike attacked him. First, the lie came easily, born of desperation and love, and the absolute certainty that her husband was innocent of murder. She saw surprise flicker across Cal's face, followed by understanding, and something that might have been admiration. A carving? Morrison asked. His initials. PG. Cal said Pike dropped the knife when he fell, and Cal carved the initials to mark it as evidence of self-defense before he fled. Ruth's voice grew stronger as she developed the story. If that knife still exists, if it's in Sheriff Garrett's possession, it would prove that Pike was armed when he died. Morrison considered this information with the careful attention of someone trying to determine truth from fiction. Even if such a knife existed, it wouldn't necessarily prove self-defense. But it would prove Pike was armed, wouldn't it? Judge Harwell interjected. It would contradict witness testimony that claimed he was unarmed when he died. Ruth felt the baby's head crowning and knew she was out of time for legal maneuvering. The child was coming now, in the middle of her husband's trial, and she would either give birth to a baby whose father was free or one whose father was bound for a Texas prison. "Sarah," she gasped, "help me. The baby's coming now." The baby arrived with the storm clouds that had been building on the western horizon all evening. Her first cry cutting through the humid air just as thunder rolled across the Kansas prairie. Ruth collapsed back against Sarah Mueller's supporting arms, exhausted but triumphant, while Dr. Walsh worked to clear the infant's breathing, and Cal stood frozen between joy and terror as Deputy Morrison waited for the drama to conclude. "A daughter," Dr. Walsh announced, his professional satisfaction evident despite the unusual circumstances of the birth. Small but healthy, and with a fine set of lungs. Ruth reached for her child with trembling hands, marveling at the tiny face that looked up at her with dark eyes that seemed far too alert for someone who'd been in the world less than a minute. The baby's hair was dark like her own, but her features carried something of Cal's stubborn chin and the promise of his steady grey gaze. "She's beautiful," Cal said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Ruth, she's perfect." For a moment, the legal proceedings faded into insignificance as the small crowd gathered around to witness the miracle of new life. Even Deputy Morrison stepped closer, his official sternness softening as he looked down at the infant who'd chosen such dramatic timing for her entrance into the world. Ruth wrapped the baby in Sarah's quilt, noting how the different fabric scraps seemed to embrace the child like a promise of community acceptance. This was her daughter, hers and Cal's, and she would grow up knowing that she'd been born into a place where people fought for each other, where love could triumph over law when justice demanded it. "Deputy Morrison," Judge Harwell said quietly, "perhaps we could postpone further proceedings until Mrs. Danner has recovered from her ordeal." "Actually," Morrison replied, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, "I'd like to hear more about this knife Mrs. Danner mentioned, the one with carved initials." Ruth looked up from her daughter, recognizing the lifeline Morrison was offering. Whether he believed her story or simply wanted an excuse to avoid arresting a new father in front of his infant child, she wasn't sure. But she could see doubt in his pale eyes, a questioning of the certainty he'd carried from Texas. "Tell him." "Cal," she said softly. "Tell him about the knife." Cal met her gaze, understanding passing between them like a shared breath. He'd known immediately that Ruth was lying to protect him, but he could also see the wisdom in her desperate gambit. If Morrison had doubts about the case, if he could be convinced to investigate further rather than making an immediate arrest, it might provide time for the truth to emerge. Pike Garrett carried a bone-handled knife, Cal said carefully, his words carrying the weight of truth mixed with necessary fiction. When he came at me with it outside the saloon, I defended myself. After he fell, after I realized he was dead, I marked the weapon, PG carved into the bone handle. I was young, scared, thought maybe someone would need proof someday that he'd been armed. Morrison studied Cal's face with the attention of someone trained to detect deception. You're saying Sheriff Garrett has this knife in his possession? I'm saying Pike had it when he died. What happened to it afterward? Cal shrugged. Sheriff's evidence, I'd assume. Evidence that would contradict the witness statements if it showed carved initials, Judge Harwell observed. Evidence that might suggest a different version of events than what's been presented. The baby stirred in Ruth's arms, making small sounds that drew everyone's attention back to the miracle they'd just witnessed. Ruth found herself thinking about Cal's pocket watch, the timepiece he'd thought lost but still carried despite its broken chain. Time had a way of revealing truth. She realized, of bringing hidden things to light when the moment was right. Deputy Morrison, she said quietly, my husband's not going anywhere. Our daughter was just born. I need time to recover, and the community needs his help with the drought. Surely you could telegraph Sheriff Garrett, ask him to examine his evidence. If there's no knife with carved initials, then Cal's lying, and you can arrest him next week just as easily as tonight. Morrison considered her proposal, his gaze moving between Cal's hopeful face and the infant who represented everything at stake in this decision. Ruth could see the conflict in his expression, duty warring with doubt, legal obligation competing with human decency. And if there is such a knife, Morrison asked, then maybe you need to ask harder questions about those witness statements, Jonas Mueller said from the edge of the crowd. Maybe you need to wonder why 3 people would lie about a man's death. Or maybe, Sarah Mueller added with the practical wisdom of someone who'd lived through frontier justice, you need to wonder what kind of sheriff lets family grief override proper investigation. The thunder was growing closer now, promising the kind of storm that could wash away drought or destroy everything in its path. Ruth held her daughter closer, feeling the baby's tiny heartbeat against her chest, like a promise of hope in uncertain times. Very well, Morrison said finally, his decision carrying the weight of someone choosing conscience over convenience. I'll send a telegram to Sheriff Garrett tonight. Ask him to examine the evidence from Pike Garrett's death. If there's a knife with carved initials, I want to know about it. And if there isn't, Cal asked, then I'll arrest you for murder and take you back to Texas to face trial. Morrison's voice carried no apology, just the grim recognition of duty that couldn't be avoided indefinitely. Ruth felt Cal's hand touch her shoulder, gentle and warm, despite the calluses from months of hard labor. That's fair, he said quietly, more than fair considering. I'll need your word that you won't try to run, Morrison added. Your word that you'll be here when I get Garrett's response. Cal looked down at Ruth and their newborn daughter. His expression showing the weight of everything he stood to lose or gain based on a telegraph message from Texas. You have my word. I won't run from my family. Judge Harwell nodded with evident relief. Then this hearing is adjourned pending new evidence. Deputy Morrison, you're welcome to stay in town as my guest until the matter is resolved. The crowd began to disperse as the first drops of rain started falling, promising relief from the drought that had brought them all together in the first place. Ruth watched her neighbors return to their homes, noting the way they looked back at her small family with expressions that ranged from hope to curiosity to genuine affection. Dr. Walsh finished his examination of both mother and child, pronouncing them healthy despite the dramatic circumstances of the birth. She's a fighter, he said with satisfaction, packing his instruments with the efficient movements of someone who'd delivered babies in far stranger places. Takes after her mother, I'd say. Sarah Mueller lingered after the others had gone, helping. Ruth settled into a more comfortable position while Cal stoked the fire against the cooling evening air. The rain was falling steadily now, drumming against the cabin roof with the steady rhythm of answered prayers. What will you name her? Sarah asked, admiring the baby who'd dozed off despite the evening's excitement. Ruth looked up at Cal, seeing her own wonder reflected in his grey eyes. They'd discussed names during the long summer evenings, but somehow none of their careful choices seemed adequate for a child who'd entered the world during such extraordinary circumstances. Hope, Ruth said suddenly, the name feeling right the moment she spoke it. Hope Dana. Cal smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Hope, he repeated softly, testing the sound. Perfect. Outside, the storm continued to build, but inside their small cabin, three people who'd found each other through necessity were discovering that love, once planted, could survive almost anything, even the uncertain promise of tomorrow's telegram from Texas. Ruth held her daughter close and listened to the rain washing the drought from the Kansas earth, thinking about new beginnings and second chances and the way hope could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. 3 days later, the telegram arrived on a morning when the world looked washed clean by the storms that had finally broken the drought. Deputy Morrison found Cal splitting wood behind the cabin, the rhythmic sound of the axe providing counterpoint to baby Hope's contented gurgling from the porch, where Ruth sat, nursing her in the early sunlight. Morrison's face revealed nothing. As he approached, the yellow paper in his hand fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. Cal set down his axe and turned to face whatever verdict the telegraph had delivered, his expression calm despite the tension Ruth could see in the set of his shoulders. "What does it say?" Ruth asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Morrison cleared his throat and read directly from the message. Deputy Morrison, stop. Knife found in evidence room, stop. Bone handle carved PG as described, stop. Witness Tom Garrett admits lying about circumstances, stop. Billy Garrett fled county, stop. Charges against Calvin Dana dropped, stop. Sheriff Wade Garrett. The words hung in the morning air like a benediction, transforming everything they'd feared into the promise of freedom. Ruth felt tears start down her cheeks as the full impact settled over her. Cal was innocent, officially and completely, cleared of all charges by the very sheriff who'd been hunting him for 2 years. "I'll be damned," Cal said quietly, his voice carrying wonder and relief in equal measure. "The knife was real," Morrison continued, folding the telegram with careful precision. "Garrett found it exactly where you said it would be. Carved initials. And all. Tom Garrett broke down when confronted with the evidence, admitted he and his cousins lied because they wanted someone to blame for Pike's death." Ruth struggled to her feet, holding Hope carefully as she moved to stand beside her husband. The baby seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, making small, satisfied sounds as she looked up at her parents with eyes that were already shifting from newborn blue to the grey of her father's gaze. "What happens now?" Ruth asked. "Now Mr. Dana is a free man," Morrison replied, extending his hand to Cal with genuine respect. "I owe you an apology, sir. I was doing my job following legal orders, but I should have asked harder questions before riding all the way to Kansas." Cal shook the deputy's hand firmly. "You did what you thought was right. Can't fault a man for that." Morrison tipped his hat to Ruth with formal courtesy. "Mrs. Danner, your husband's a lucky man. Not many wives would have stood by him the way you did." "Not many husbands would have been worth standing by," Ruth replied, meaning every word. After Morrison departed, heading back to Texas with a very different story than the one he'd come to write, Ruth and Cal found themselves alone with their daughter and the strange luxury of an uncertain future that belonged entirely to them. "So what do we do now?" Ruth asked, settling back into her chair while Cal resumed his wood-splitting with movements that seemed lighter, more relaxed than they'd been in months. "Now we build a life," Cal replied, pausing in his work to look at her directly. "The three of us here in Kansas without looking over our shoulders for trouble that's not coming anymore." Ruth nodded, understanding the magnitude of what that freedom represented. For the first time since Thomas Henley had abandoned her, she could look toward the future without fear. For the first time since arriving at her door, half frozen and Desperate, Cal could make plans that extended beyond simple survival. "I've been thinking," Cal continued, "about expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom, maybe a larger kitchen. Hope's going to need space to grow, and if we're blessed with more children, more children." Ruth smiled at the assumption implicit in his words, that their marriage, born of necessity, had become something worth expanding. "If you want them," Cal said, suddenly uncertain. "I know we didn't exactly marry for love, but I hoped—" "Cal," Ruth interrupted gently. "Come here." He approached the porch with the careful attention he'd shown her throughout their marriage, as if she were something precious that required gentle handling. Ruth reached for his hand, feeling the familiar calluses and warmth that had become as comforting as her father's old quilt. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying all the weight of everything they'd shared and survived together. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you care for people without expecting anything in return. I love watching you with hope, seeing how gentle you are with something so small and vulnerable." Cal's expression softened into something that might have been wonder. "Ruth, and I love the way you say my name," she continued, "like it's something beautiful instead of something shameful. You gave me back my dignity when I thought I'd lost it forever." Cal knelt beside her chair, his gray eyes serious as he studied her face. "I love you too," he said quietly. "Started falling for you that first night when you opened your door to a stranger in a storm. Fell harder every day, watching you face whatever came with more courage than I thought possible." Hope stirred between them, making the small sounds. That indicated hunger, or simply the desire for attention. Ruth looked down at her daughter and marveled at how completely their lives had changed since that stormy night when everything had seemed hopeless. "I want to show you something," Cal said, reaching into his shirt pocket to withdraw a small object wrapped in cloth. "I've been working on this in the evenings after you've gone to sleep." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a piece of wood, no larger than his palm, carved with exquisite detail into the image of a family. A man, a woman, and a baby, their faces turned toward each other with expressions of love and contentment. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every line and curve shaped with the patience of someone who understood that the most beautiful things required time to create properly. "It's us," Ruth said softly, tracing the carved figures with one finger. Our family," Cal agreed. "I wanted Hope to have something that showed where she came from, how much she was wanted, even before she arrived." Ruth felt fresh tears start, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. The carved portrait would sit on their mantel beside her father's Bible and Cal's wooden cross, representing the family they'd built from the remnants of their individual heartbreaks. "There's something else I want to give you," Cal said, reaching into his other pocket to withdraw his father's pocket watch. The chain had been repaired with careful stitching, and the brass case gleamed with fresh polishing. "This belonged to my father and his father before him. I want Hope to have it someday, but I thought you should hold it until she's old enough." Ruth accepted the watch with reverence, understanding the significance of the gift. This wasn't just a timepiece. It was Cal's legacy, his family's history, and by giving it to their daughter, he was declaring that their hastily arranged marriage had become something permanent and precious. "We'll tell her the whole story," Ruth said, closing the watch case carefully. "How her father came to us in a storm, how her mother chose love over safety, how they built something beautiful from pieces that seemed broken." Cal smiled, reaching out to touch Hope's tiny hand where it rested against Ruth's chest. "And we'll tell her that sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never see coming." The morning sun climbed higher over the Kansas prairie, warming. The earth that had finally received the rain it needed to flourish. In the distance, Ruth could see Jonas Miller working in his fields, taking advantage of the cooler temperatures and improved soil conditions. Sarah would be preparing the community celebration they'd planned for the end of the drought, a gathering that would also serve as Hope's unofficial christening. Ruth thought about the woman she'd been 8 months ago, desperate, alone, convinced that her life was effectively over. Now she sat on her porch with a husband who loved her, a healthy daughter, and a community that had learned to see past surface judgments to the character underneath. "Cal," she said as he prepared to return to his work, "do you ever regret it? The way we started, the circumstances that brought us together?" Cal considered the question seriously, his gaze moving between Ruth's face and their sleeping daughter. "I regret that you had to face judgment and hardship," he said finally. "I regret that people treated you poorly, that you felt alone and scared. But regret marrying you, regret building this life with you." He shook his head firmly. "Never, not for a single moment." Ruth nodded, satisfied with his answer because it matched her own feelings exactly. Their beginning had been marked by desperation and necessity, but their middle and their future belonged entirely to love. As Cal returned to his wood-splitting and Hope dozed in the morning warmth, Ruth found herself thinking about the sermon. Her father had preached the Sunday before his death. He'd spoken about redemption, about how God could bring beauty from ashes and hope from despair. At the time, carrying Thomas Henley's child and facing an uncertain future, she'd found little comfort in his words. Now she understood what he'd been trying to tell her. Sometimes salvation came in the form of an unexpected stranger. Sometimes love grew from the smallest acts of kindness. Sometimes the very circumstances that seemed like punishment became the foundation for blessings beyond imagination. The carved family portrait sat in her lap, catching the sunlight and throwing tiny shadows that danced with Hope's gentle breathing. Their story would become part of Millfield's folklore, she realized, the tale of the preacher's daughter who gave shelter to a stranger and found love in return, the cowboy who stayed not because he had to, but because he'd learned what staying meant. Future generations would hear their story and perhaps find hope in it during their own dark moments. Children would grow up knowing that love could triumph over judgment, that communities could choose mercy over law, that the most beautiful families were often built from broken pieces that somehow fit together perfectly. Ruth smiled and closed her eyes, letting the Kansas sunshine warm her face while she listened to the sounds of her husband working and her daughter breathing, and her neighbors beginning their daily routines in a world made new by rain and second chances. Sometimes, she thought, the best fairy tales were the ones that began with "once upon a storm" and ended with "they built something worth keeping."